Yeah, so today kind of put some of the things together that we talked about last time, as well as some other stuff with the kidneys. So yeah, so we'll dive right into that. Um, we'll talk a little bit about fluid coming into our bodies versus fluid coming out, and then what that looks like. And so we'll do a couple calculations with that today as well. So in terms of fluid loss, fluid output, most of the water that we lose in our bodies, we can't really control. It's obligatory, right? We can't really control that. The reason for that is we have to get rid of urea because when we break down proteins and nucleic acids, one of the waste products is nitrogen. We can't get rid of nitrogen without water. So we're losing the water around that. Same thing with feces, right? We need water for it to be soft enough for it to move. Sweating, temperature regulation requires water loss. And then when we talk and we breathe, we're losing water as well. And all of that's just water loss that we can't really control, right? So we're always losing water, right? Which is why we're always also needing to drink. And so then we regulate the urine volume by what we talked about last time, right? By the ADH, renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, all of those different hormones we talked about is kind of how we regulate how much water loss we have in the urine, right? But then these other bits of water loss are obligatory. So what about on the intake side? Thirst is obviously the big thing here. Thirst is controlled by our hypothalamus, like many other of these key homeostatic things are. And we get less, ADH is what stimulates thirst for us. But we get kind of less sensitive to this with age. And the risk of being severely dehydrated can be greater in the elderly population because of this. Having a dry mouth also stimulates thirst. But our thirst sensation gets inhibited following drinking. But this initially happens just when our mouth becomes wet, even before we swallow any water. So this can kind of make it, it can kind of make it so you have to drink a little bit more to actually make it so you're not thirsty anymore. But then we also get thirst inhibited by stretching out our stomach too. When we put fluid in our stomach, the stomach stretches out, and that helps us to not be thirsty anymore. Okay, but this whole idea of our thirst is quenched when water is in our mouth, right? And this is the whole reason for this is that by drinking too much water, it can be dangerous. We can dilute our body fluid, right? And so it's kind of trying to prevent that idea of taking in too much fluid. Okay, so yeah, so just a quick recap on what we just talked about. What are the sources of water loss? How do we regulate our urine volume? And then what regulates fluid intake? Okay, go ahead and fill all of this in with your team. Turn to the people on your team, fill this in, and then we'll jump into some kind of calculation stuff on renal clearance.
And then regulating your volume.
A lot of people did go home early, I think. Huh? This whole team is gone here. That's interesting. Yeah. Thanks for asking. Yeah, one was definitely like knocked loose, and they could see that on the X-ray, but the dentist thought it would heal up.
Oh, really? So
But
it's fine.
yeah, so it's like it's solid still, but it's like he could see like where it was dislodged, but he thought it would probably heal up. But now we just kind of wait for like 4 to 8 weeks and see if it starts going dead. If it doesn't, they got to do a root canal. Yeah, so yeah. You got punched in the face. Yeah.
By another kid?
Yes. A very, yeah, it was, yeah. Yeah, I can tell you after class, but yeah. Yeah, yeah, he handled it well, but he did not beat the other kid up, which he could have, but he did. Yeah, so, yeah, it was and 16, he's 16 today. Today's his birthday. Yeah. He's a big kid. He's like my size.
Big.
Yeah, he's like my size, and the kid's a lot smaller. So yeah, he could have really hurt him, but he didn't. So it's good. Huh? Yeah, my son. Yeah, sort of. Yeah. All right, let's go ahead and come back together here. Okay. So yeah, the sources of the water loss are just right on the previous slide. Obviously, the regulation of urine volume is going to be mainly related to our ADH levels and our aldosterone levels. Right, so we talked about those key hormones. The hormone that regulates fluid intake, what hormone did you put there? ADH, right? That's going to be responsible for thirst, part of the brain. What'd you put there? Hypothalamus. All right, and then the one condition that we talked about that was related to ADH, what was that condition that we talked about? You guys remember? It's a type of diabetes, right? Yeah, so diabetes insipidus. Diabetes insipidus is either lack of ADH or lack of ADH receptors. And it just creates lots and lots of urine, right? Massive amounts of urine. Okay, this is what we talked about. This is kind of reviewing from previous lectures, but which ion's the main determinant of tonicity in our blood? What did you guys say for that one? Sarah, what did you say? Sodium, yep, absolutely. Yep. Sodium, and then main ion inside of our cells. What do you think? Isabel, what'd you say? Huh? Nope, not sodium. Sodium's the main one outside. Just the other one. Potassium, there you go. And you get it. Yeah, potassium. So sodium's the primary ion of the extracellular space, and then potassium's the primary ion of the intracellular space inside of our cells. Okay, and then the hormone that is really kind of controlling ion balance out of the ones we talked about would be aldosterone. Remember, ADH is really focused on water, and then aldosterone really focuses on sodium. Okay. And then things that lead to more sodium reabsorption would be the things that lead to aldosterone release, right? So that would be high potassium levels or increased osmotic pressure in the blood. Or the third one that led to renin release was decreased blood flow to the kidneys. To the kids. Put it on the bottom there. But, okay. Yeah. So then, yeah, so really that's all about increased aldosterone is what causes that, right? So aldosterone causes that. But then potassium conservation would be a decrease in aldosterone. right? Because remember, when we have a lot of aldosterone on board, we pull back sodium, we bring it back, and then we get rid of potassium. So in order to save potassium, we have to decrease our aldosterone levels. Yeah. Questions on that?
Could you read the last ones that you're just talking about?
Sure. Yeah. So what leads to more sodium reabsorption? Really, it's increased aldosterone. That's the main thing. But then I kind of went into the stimuli for the release of aldosterone, which would be high potassium or high osmotic pressure of the blood, right? So like your blood is highly concentrated. And then the third one would be what causes renin release, which is that low blood flow to the kidneys, right? Because then renin eventually results in angiotensin II, which eventually results in aldosterone release. And then what would lead to more potassium conservation or reabsorption would be just decrease in aldosterone, because aldosterone causes us to release potassium. So to save potassium, we would decrease aldosterone. Yeah. Okay. All right. So we're going to discuss a topic here called renal clearance. Okay. So the definition of renal clearance is we take the volume of the plasma from which a substance is completely cleared by the kidneys, and we do that in a unit of time. Okay. So the reason that we care about renal clearance is mostly for drugs. Okay. So for prescription drugs that are given, ones that are cleared by the kidneys, the dosing is dependent on how fast that drug is dealt with by your kidneys. If it has a super high renal clearance, that means as soon as it gets in there, the kidneys pull all of it out of the blood. That means you're going to need a higher dosage of that drug to have it work, right? If you have a real low renal clearance of a substance, then you don't need as strong of a dose because it's going to stay in your blood for longer. Okay, so the way we can calculate this is renal clearance equals U, which is the concentration of that substance that shows up in the urine, okay, how much actually was released from the body, multiplied by total flow rate of urine, okay? So V stands for flow rate of urine formation, and then we divide that by how much of that substance is in the plasma, okay? So you're measuring the amount of substance in the plasma, in the blood, measure an amount that was released in the urine, and then measure the total amount of urine that was released. Okay, and that's going to give you renal clearance. Okay, because it's like, here's how much is in the blood. All right, here's how much we got rid of relative to how much urination was there total. And so then putting those together gives us how much the kidneys took out of the blood. Right. So the examples would be, we always need to do this relative to GFR. Okay, turn to your partner real quick, your team, and remind each other of what GFR stands for and what that means.
Oh.
Okay, what do we got? Who knows GFR? I know Ashlyn does. You're looking at me, Ashlyn. What's GFR mean? No, you don't want to say it? You know it though, you just don't want to say it. Who's got GFR? Molly? GFR? Very close. Filtration rate. Yeah. Yeah. Glomerular filtration rate, right? This represents how much fluid gets pulled out of the blood when it passes through the kidneys, right? Like how much of the total filtrate do we make? Okay. And so when we talk about renal clearance, we always want to know what it is relative to the total glomerular filtration rate. Okay. So when our renal clearance equals GFR, what that means is that whatever that substance is that we're looking at, let's say it's Tylenol, right? We put some Tylenol, we take some Tylenol, it shows up in our blood, right? If that level of the Tylenol that gets cleared equals the same amount of our total filtration rate of our kidneys, then we know that that substance is freely filtered, meaning it can get through the glomerulus and get into the tubes of the kidneys, right? We don't add more of it to the filtrate. That's what secreted means, right? If we secreted it, we would add more of it to the urine to try to get rid of it. But we also don't bring it back, right? We don't reabsorb it. Okay, so those are pretty much our options. We filter it. Does it make it through the glomerulus? So then it shows up in the filtrate, right? As we're passing through all the tubes of the kidneys, do we add more of that substance? That would be secreting it. or do we pull it back? That would be reabsorbing it, right? So if a substance's renal clearance equals GFR, then we know it's not secreted, not reabsorbed, but it was filtered. So these substances tend to be really good ones for calculating kidney function because they're going to equal our GFR, and GFR is a really important clinical marker of how our kidneys are working. So a couple examples, inulin is a type of starch that shows up in our blood, like a type of fiber. And it's one of these things that where renal clearance equals GFR. Creatinine is another one. Creatinine is a byproduct of metabolism in muscle cells with the creatine phosphate system. And so sometimes when you get a full blood panel, you'll see creatinine levels on your report. Has anybody seen that on a blood test you've gotten creatinine? Yeah, you guys are too young to get actual blood tests, but yeah, yeah. Someday you'll go get a physical and they'll just do a full blood panel and you'll see creatinine levels because they're testing your kidney function. Okay, so that's if they equal. If renal clearance is less than GFR, that means that it was filtered, but then the kidneys brought it back, right? Because if the amount that we get rid of is less than what was in the blood that we filtered, then that means we must have pulled it back. So these are things that the body doesn't want to lose, right? So sodium, glucose, amino acids, nutrients we're not trying to lose, right? And then if it's the opposite, if our renal clearance is greater than our GFR, that must mean that we filtered it, yes, but then we added more of that thing as it was passing through the kidneys, right? Because this is a waste product, right? This is something that we want to get rid of. Okay, so this is freely filtered and secreted. Okay, so potassium was one of these things. Pretty much all drug metabolites. Tylenol is going to be an example of those. Penicillin is going to be another example of those that are cleared by the kidneys. And so we're going to see higher renal clearance than we do GFR. Okay, yeah, so that's that. We'll go through a series of questions that kind of has you look at this, but questions on this so far? Yeah, Molly? Uh-huh. You are, yeah. Yeah, you're supposed to drink more water because it's like it's a heavy salt that you're putting into your system, and a lot of that goes into your muscle. And so then you need to just you end up holding on to more fluid in your muscle. So then you can because the water goes with that salt as it goes into your muscle. So then if you don't have as much fluid on board, then your blood will be dehydrated because of the water that got pulled into your muscle to go with the creatine. So yeah. So yeah, somewhat related to this, the creatinine is kind of a separate thing. I don't know if you would have higher creatinine levels while taking creatine. I don't think so, but it's a good question if that's where you're headed with that. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Other questions on that? Yeah, Ashley?
Test and you're trying to feel like pregnant or like doing like
Uh-huh.
hormone test.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's only certain hormones that would. So so yeah, so HCG is the one that they test for in pregnancy tests. So human chorionic gonadotropin, which fun fact of the day is the one that Jurickson Profar was just caught with. I don't know if anybody's Padres fans, but or baseball fans, but he was on the Padres last year as one of our stars. Got traded to the Braves. And now he's missing most of the season because he was caught with a performance-enhancing drug. It happened to be HCG, and I didn't know it looks like he's pregnant, right? I didn't know HCG was used to. It actually stimulates testosterone release in males. But yeah, so that hormone. It's got to be, yeah, I don't know the chemical structure of that one, but it has to be small enough to get into the urine. So like growth hormone doesn't show up in your urine because it's too big. It's too big of a protein. But I'm guessing that one is a protein because most of those are. And so it must just be a small enough protein that actually gets into our urine as well. Because or they just did a blood test. Yeah, it could have been that. But in pregnancy tests, obviously it does get into your blood. So yeah, typically we might see other hormones, but they have to be small enough proteins, or they could be other proteins like amine proteins or amine hormones. But typically big ones like growth hormone, insulin stuff, we don't usually see those in the urine because they're just large enough proteins they can't get through the glomerulus. So yeah, and yeah, I'll look that one up after to see why that one gets into the urine and the other ones don't. But it's just I'm sure it's a size thing. But yeah, so yeah, other questions on that? Yeah.
difference between freely filtered and filtered again?
Yeah, there's no difference there. I probably just forgot to put freely on that one. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Isabel. Say that one more time. Yeah, it's related to that. So like, especially when we say like your body metabolizes that drug really fast or something, that would be kind of like a way of saying this. But some drugs are dealt with by the liver, right? And then like alcohol is dealt with by the liver. So we don't really have the kidneys don't alcohol doesn't put a lot of stress on the kidneys as much. It can eventually, but it's more stress on the liver because the liver is responsible for pulling that alcohol out of our bloodstream. But the kidneys are responsible for pulling other types of chemicals out of the bloodstream. So both of those we would say like, is that drug metabolized in the liver or metabolized in the kidneys? It's getting at that same idea of like dealing with it. So yeah, similar idea for sure. Yeah. Other questions on that? Okay, so let's do a couple questions here. So go ahead and chat with your team here. So this is just giving you the number of the renal clearance. You have GFR to use. Turn with your team, decide which of those three categories this substance would fit into if its renal clearance was 50. And I'll turn on the clickers. All right, go ahead and send in your answer there if you haven't yet. All right, anybody else? Is that everybody? I got 29, 30. There we go. At least we made 30. Yeah. 31. Okay, so everybody is saying B. So this substance will be freely filtered, but then reabsorbed, right? We pulled some of it back because that renal clearance is lower than the filtration rate, right? So the amount that was put into the filtrate was there, but then we pulled some of that back. So we didn't lose that same amount that was in the filtrate. Okay, next one. This one we choose all that apply. All right, so put those answers, hit the send button. Make sure you hit send. You can put more than one. Yes, hit send. Well, show me two responses. Doesn't seem right. That's weird. I think it's just not working. Try that again. Try it one more time. Just hit send again. You should be able to just hit send. Close. Yeah, I think it's kind of. Oh, try it now. Okay. Anybody else? You got it? Okay, so the correct ones here would be E, glucose, G, sodium, and then any amino acids that show up in the urine as well. So things that we would want to bring back, right? Okay, this one, go ahead. We can do the same thing here. Go ahead, check with people on your team real quick. Which substances are freely filtered, not reabsorbed, not secreted. All right. Go ahead, make sure you hit send there. Looks like everybody is saying A and B, creatinine and inulin. Okay. All right, and we got one more here. So pick a substance here. Go ahead. Same thing. Go ahead and hit the send button whenever you're ready. Okay. And so this would be an example of a waste product or a drug that the kidneys get rid of. So penicillin is one of those. Tylenol is one of those, and potassium is something that we're constantly kind of shedding as well, getting rid of potassium. Okay. Questions about any of this with renal clearance? Okay, then we'll just move on to the last thing, which has to do with the urination process and the reflex involved there. So we've talked about how all of the little tubes eventually funnel down into the renal pelvis, right? And then from those collecting ducts, all the collecting ducts point down to the renal pelvis, and then that renal pelvis connects to the ureter in each kidney, right? The ureter is covered with smooth muscle, and so during the urination process, even before that, just to fill the bladder, the ureter can contract peristaltically, which we'll talk about that more in the digestive tract next week, but that's like contractions and waves that kind of squeezes everything downwards, okay? And so those peristaltic contractions move everything down, and the more parasympathetic activity we have, the more we do this process. And then the more sympathetic activity we have, the less urine we create, the less urination occurs. Again, urination and production of urine is more of like a housekeeping function, not a stress-induced function. Okay, the bladder is a unique tissue because it's that type of transitional epithelium that we talked about last semester, where the cells are kind of like columnar at first, but then when we stretch them out, they kind of flatten out, gives it that like elasticity. So as we fill the bladder, the pressure increases more. So when the bladder is kind of moderately full, that's might be about half a liter of fluid. We get a larger increase in pressure after that. Okay. And then typically the average max capacity of the bladder is about 1 liter, 1,000 mils. And it is possible to rupture your bladder, especially when it's full, and then you receive a blunt force trauma to it while it's full. It can rupture it, which is definitely can be a life-threatening injury for sure. So, yeah. Okay, and then the reflex involved in this is called the micturition reflex, but we'll get to that in a sec. The micturition reflex involves relaxing sphincters at the right time and then contracting smooth muscle at the right time. And so one thing just to note, both males and females have both an internal urethral sphincter and then an external urethral sphincter, right? So you can see those areas. And so take a guess and just check with this on your with your teammates, which one you think would be under voluntary control and then which one's under involuntary. And I will just circle this one for the one you're going to send in on your clickers. Okay, which one is voluntary, which one is involuntary? Check with each other on that real quick. All right, what did you guys say? All right, go ahead and send it in if you haven't yet. Maybe about 5 more of you, I think. All right, so about 80% of you are saying B for the voluntary one, which then you would say A for the involuntary one, and that's correct, right? We'll talk about the details of that in a second. But we want the one that's like further down to be the one we voluntarily control, right? Because it wouldn't make much sense the other way. Because the reflex just opens one up, right? And then, then it's up to us to be able to voluntarily stop the other one and close it, right? So here's the way the reflex works. There are stretch receptors in the wall of the bladder, okay, detecting how stretched out the bladder is, okay? And then there's afferent nerves from the pelvic region of our spinal cord that go to, that are receiving the signal from those stretch receptors, okay? So if you get enough stretch, sends a signal up to the spinal cord, but it's the sacral region of the spinal cord, okay? And then some different efferent nerves, again, coming from the sacral region, are sending signals down, okay? One of those signals is relaxation, okay? So relaxing that internal urinary sphincter, okay? So it just opens up, all right? But then we want to contract the smooth muscle around the bladder, right? To squeeze the urine out. Okay, that's all the reflexive part. Okay. Luckily for us, we have the external one too, right? Because we can voluntarily control that one. And so the voluntary portion is that we also need to inhibit the motor neurons that control the external urinary sphincter. So then we can cause that to relax and it can open up. Last line just says inhibit motor neurons, then relax and open. Okay, don't put your stuff away yet. We're going to do one more thing before you guys take off. But let's look back on this real quick, because I think the anatomy here is just kind of interesting. Where there's space between the two sphincters, right? And so this one opens up automatically. Urine's able to get into this little spot between the two, right? We've all had the situation where we have to pee really, really bad, and it feels like we almost do a little bit, right? And it's like, because the urine actually moves from one spot to the next, and now it's like in that like spot in the middle, right? So yeah, I just think it's interesting. But anyways, so that's it. That's urination. Next week we'll get into the digestive system and all of that. So, but before you guys leave, since we're done so early, I would love if you pulled out your device. I sent the course evaluation to you right before class again on a Canvas announcement. Okay, so if you could pull that out and just take the 5 or 10 minutes that it takes to complete that course evaluation for this class, I would appreciate that. Okay, so go ahead and do that for me if you haven't already done it. And yeah, that'll be it. And best practices for me to leave while you're doing that, so you're not thinking about me and yeah, not being influenced by me standing here. So yeah, so go ahead, take those couple minutes to do that, and we'll see you guys next week. Have a fantastic Easter. Okay. All right. All right. Okay. Bye-bye. All right.
already
You
did
too,
that.
Emily. Yeah.
That's what-
Okay. Yeah.